Good morning, everybody. We're going to give folks just a minute to arrive, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. All right, Angie, why don't we go ahead and get started? And as other people arrive, we can admit them and bring them up to speed.
That sounds great. Thank you, Cadence. I'm just watching all the people entering the room. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Angie Brewer with DLCD. I'm the project manager for this work, and I'm joined by Kelly Reed from DLCD as well as a few others on the working group. We are getting, oh, I hear a couple of mics. Thank you. We are getting into sort of the meat of the discussion today, so it's kind of an exciting meeting to be able to have with you all. I just briefly want to share that we've had a few members who've had to step away to other priorities in their organizations, and as a result, a few new members join us. So I just want to acknowledge Rod Walker has joined us. He's new to our work group. He's a retired Oregon Child Development Coalition participant, and Petra Schwitz, I'm sorry if I did that wrong, from Benton County. And Lindsay Cochran is an ex officio member who's joining us, sort of a cross-pollination, if you will, of Business Oregon's childcare infrastructure bill that they're working on. So if you're on the screen or entering the room, please feel free to wave and say hello. Everyone else, if you are able to plug your name and do a bit of a self-intro into the chat, that way we can kind of see who's in the room. And help us get into it a bit today. Like I said, today is our first opportunity to kind of dig into what we heard, and you're going to hear more from Leanne and Cadence about the outcomes of the surveys and the engagement that we did with providers and regulatory partners and many others. But I just want to briefly share that the draft we sent out was an imperfect draft. We're still learning a lot, and your feedback really matters. We received some great substantive feedback from Tony Rocco at Building Codes a couple of days ago, and it's exactly what we need. This is an opportunity to learn from each other and make sure that we've got the information down correctly and build this body of work moving forward. So I would just want to acknowledge that this report is long. If you've not yet carved out some time to read it, it's worth reading. It's 60 plus pages in its current form. We're going to go through it today to make sure that you have sort of the basis of it, the foundational pieces, but it's definitely worth going through and spending some dedicated time on so that we've got it right. So I will stop there and turn it over to our partners at Echo Northwest. I think, Leanne, you're going to kick us off with the next slide. But again, thank you all for making the time. It's exciting to be here for meeting number 2. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Angie. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. So I'll just quickly go over our agenda for today's meeting at a high level. We'll quickly review the project schedule next. We'll then kind of move through a brief summary of some of the survey results. We've had 2 surveys. One was for providers, and then DLCD developed some childcare development scenarios to help us better understand how local jurisdictions might process different types of projects. Then we'll review some of the key findings from the barriers report, have a discussion as a large group aimed at getting your feedback and reactions to the content we've developed so far. I also just want to note this isn't the only opportunity during this meeting to provide the feedback. As Angie mentioned, please send it to DLCD staff. It's really, really helpful to have your individual expertise on the topics. And then we'll have a small group discussion on the disparate impacts. So thinking about how the different types of barriers we've been exploring might be affecting some providers, regulators, or even local jurisdictions more than others. So whether that's based on geography, race, ethnicity, language, etc. And then we'll come back together as a larger group and report out and go over some of our next steps for the project. So as we talked about in the first meeting, our work is really structured around these work group meetings. So today our goal is to discuss the engagement and barriers researched so far, identify what's missing, clarify what's unclear or inaccurate in the draft so far. Our third meeting in August will present the draft recommendations. And then in September, we'll work on refining and finalizing those recommendations as a group. And then the fifth and last meeting in October will be a chance to review the full draft report. So that'll be comprehensive of all the work we've done, engagement, barriers, and our recommendations. And then the final report is due to the legislature on December 31st. So I'll hand it over to Cadence to walk us through the work we've done so far.
Thanks, Leanne. We're going to start by sort of grounding how our work is being done, the intent that we're bringing to it, and the charge from the legislature. And so, although our team has experience in local government and in development, and we have our partners with SEA, who are architects who've worked in jurisdictions around the state of Oregon, we are not building officials, we are not working as land use planners, and we are not childcare providers. We are instead researchers who are trying to help map a pretty dang complicated system. And we have gone about doing that by doing some research and also accumulating a bunch of qualitative data. So that's talking with you all, it's focus groups with providers and regulators, and understanding through our preliminary code audits and other work, sort of what the lay of the land is and what people report as barriers to successfully expanding or opening childcare facilities in the state of Oregon. So we want to be super clear that we are not trying to pick on anybody. We are not saying that anything in the report is 100% accurate for sure. It is a draft for a reason, and we are very much interested in your feedback. And we also want to honor and respect the feedback that we have received. And so there's this perception. There's perception in multiple realities, and we're trying to understand and get as close to as we can what the perceptions are, what the experiences are, and then where there are sort of fact-based realities, we want to make sure we're pointing those out as well. And sometimes they'll be in alignment, and sometimes they might not be. And sometimes folks might come from a perspective or with a lens where things might be clear in their minds, but then other people with different perspectives and different experiences may have different perspectives. And we're going to do our best in the final draft to tease as much of that out as we can. And honestly, we're really looking for your help here in doing that. And then I'll also just add, this is the hard part of the experience, right? Where we're trying to shine light, we're trying to uncover all of the things that are causing barriers. And next time we get to do kind of the happy stuff, which is, all right, what are our opportunities for resolving some of these barriers? And so I think if we can all together continue to do as we did in the first session, be respectful of each other, have an open mind, not take things personally. That's going to be on me as much as anybody else, I'm sure. And really come with a solutions mindset about how can we understand differing perspectives and use those differing perspectives to brainstorm next time and then as we continue to work through this process, develop a set of recommendations for the legislature to consider. I think we're all going to be in a really much better place. So with that, I'm going to move on to what we've heard thus far. So to inform our barriers and opportunities report, we took feedback from you all from the first work group meeting. We've conducted interviews with providers and architects. We've had focus groups, one with regulators and one with providers. And then we had 2 online surveys, one for the providers, and we had 216 respondents, and one for local jurisdictions that DLCD prepared. And that one will be included in the final draft. We're on a fast clip, and I think I should have mentioned that also as part of my preamble, which is in a more perfect world, maybe we would have had more time to complete and compile all this information, but it is a matter of some urgency, and the legislature wanted feedback sooner rather than later. And so that is impacting sort of all of the things. And so we are being a little bit vulnerable and showing you stuff as it is hot off the presses, and very much need to have your collaborative effort in refining the draft. And we feel pretty confident that the final version of this barriers report is going to be as accurate as we can make it, given the time constraints, and that as we move into recommendations, we'll also be spending more time there. And we're not done with engagement. We will continue to meet with folks. We're going to have more interviews and at least one more focus group to talk about their initial feedback on recommendations. Next slide. All right, survey results. So the very short barriers report that Angie mentioned was a mere 60+ pages. Will contain more information for your review on the survey results, but we wanted to highlight some things here. So almost half of respondents are interested in expanding their business, but encountered some difficulty with zoning, code, or permitting barriers. And about 11% decided against opening a business due to these barriers. Some of the kind of top line feedback we received was the conditional use process is difficult. The requirements generally for zoning are confusing or unclear. And I think I just want to pause for a minute and recognize that childcare providers and aspiring childcare providers are also not planners and building officials. They are not experts in this system. And so when we use the words confusing or unclear, it is from the perspective of somebody who is not doing this for their job. And so for planners and building officials, when we get to the building part, some of these requirements may be much more clear and more obvious. And so I just want to point that out as we're talking about these issues. And maybe in our final draft, we'll be even more particular about from whose perspective we're talking about what is clear or unclear. And then also in zoning, this idea of what is the capacity of planners to provide enhanced assistance or timely feedback. And then building code restrictions, money. Money is perennially an issue with redevelopment or outfitting businesses. And I guess I'll also offer here that some of the feedback we're receiving, it's obviously from childcare providers or prospective applicants, and so it is applicable to their experience. It is also likely applicable to other people trying to open a business in their jurisdictions. Some issues are unique to childcare centers, and some are just like, what does it take to open a business in a place? And so I just want to be clear about that these are not exclusively childcare facility problems only. They may apply to other types of businesses as well. So the cost to update a building or required building renovations are often issues. And then cost of permitting and the process itself. And I think my kind of top line remark about that is certainty and speediness are the best things that businesses and developers can have. And if you've spent 1 hot minute at a permit counter, you're probably rolling your eyes and understanding sort of that common refrain of certainty and speed. And I don't want to minimize that, because it is true that the longer a process takes, the less certainty that there will be a positive outcome at the end of that process really is a potential barrier for folks who are trying to establish businesses. Next slide, please. So what kinds of barriers are folks encountering? And this is just more survey result. The costs and requirements of permitting is a big part of it. And then building and safety requirements, about 23 of the respondents said zoning issues also posed a problem. And on the left, you hear some thoughts. I'm not going to read them for you, but I think, it's confusing and complicated are sort of the primary conclusions that we were trying to highlight from feedback. Next slide, please. Okay, keep going. So this is a survey that DLCD prepared for local practitioners to understand how they respond to a certain set of scenarios with regard to reviewing and permitting childcare facilities. And so there was a whole host of scenarios regarding conditional uses, changes in use and occupancy, and other kind of requirements that might be triggered if you were trying to establish a childcare facility. Of the respondents, 79% were cities and 21% were counties, and less than half were in a jurisdiction of 10,000 or fewer. All right, next slide, please. So this is a condensed version of some of the summary findings. For certified family daycares, only 57% of jurisdictions say they treat this as a permitted use despite the state statute. And several said their definitions were also outdated in limiting the number of children in a family childcare home. And 44% of jurisdictions said they would require a building permit for a new certified family childcare center. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's just an indication of sort of the cost and process that these facilities are going to need to go through. And then on the right, you see 30% of jurisdictions would charge a transportation SDC additional cost because of the change in trip estimates for childcare use. And then seismic upgrades are certain in some places and potentially in others. And a good news piece is that 83% of jurisdictions offer a pre-application process. We didn't ask how much that was being charged, if anything, for those pre-app conferences, but those are the kinds of things that can be very helpful for prospective applicants who are beginning to understand how the system works. Okay, next slide, please. So some of our key findings and takeaways. It's probably no surprise to you all that the layers of regulatory agencies that folks need to navigate are complicated and confusing to the uninitiated. Because building departments and planners, they're not doing the same job, right? And they're not necessarily in the same team. It is confusing sometimes for applicants to understand that what one counter visit entails is not the totality of what will be entirely needed. There are some discrepancies as we understand it between zoning and building codes and licensing requirements. Site suitability is a big deal. So where can we even establish a childcare facility? And when you add on the varying requirements for the buildings and licensing, the sort of cohort of potential sites is smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think what we've heard pretty loud and clear from applicants and folks who have navigated the process successfully is because they're not experts, they don't know what they don't know. And they're looking to jurisdictions to help fill in many of those blanks, and they're not feeling like that's part of what they are receiving. Okay, next slide, please. Again, coming from the perspective of the applicants, the zoning codes and process requirements are confusing. They are not consistent across jurisdictions because each jurisdiction is able to set to some degree their individual processes, and people are busy. And also, there might be a disconnect on what service an applicant thinks they should be getting and what service planners think that are able to provide. And so that's another conversation that we can have about what is the role of folks at the permit counter. How can they be helpful but also not be advocates? These are things that we want to explore and see where some potential recommendations might lie. As we know, some jurisdictions have not been able to update their zoning code. Conditional use processes are by definition discretionary, and you can't know the outcome before you've completed that process. And there are some differences between an urban setting and a rural setting just because of the way that the zoning piece works, when you're inside an urban growth boundary or not. So all of that to say that applicants are finding navigating our land use and zoning system very complicated and confusing. And even if they've been able to navigate it successfully once in one place, if they move jurisdictions and want to expand elsewhere, they're sometimes confronted by new experiences that they didn't anticipate because they thought perhaps they had figured things out. Next slide. Yeah. So when we move to sort of the DELC licensing requirements that impact how the buildings are outfitted and building code itself, over half of the respondents to provider survey said that the cost of building updates made it either difficult or impossible for them to locate or expand their business. And over a third said that over $100,000 to meet those expenses. And you'll note that in our current draft, we have words like expensive. And this is from the perspective of providers. Expensive is inherently a subjective conclusion, right? Based on how much cash you have. And what is expensive to somebody who's flush will be more than somebody who is struggling to become a provider. And so I think what we can do is acknowledge that if I'm a low income applicant, cost is going to be a significant factor, and expensive is going to happen much sooner than for somebody for a center that has facilities all over the United States and has a way to leverage that money to create a new facility. So on this slide, open space requirements, some of the bathroom requirements, fire safety often require expensive renovations. It is the change in occupancy requirements are tricky and confusing for folks because they've seen businesses operate out of there, and so then they're confused why they can't do their business. Building codes and associated requirements aren't necessarily clearly articulated at the beginning of the process, right? It feels like it's linear, but sometimes it is very helpful, particularly in a pre-app situation, for some of the big building issues to be raised early so that a provider is not wasting their time going through a land use or zoning issue only to be thwarted at the building phase. And so the fact that the building issues aren't they're not aware of those issues early in the process is a real complication. That's not a blame thing. It's just a fact that if they don't know what they don't know, they might spend a whole bunch of money and time on something that they can't actually fulfill in the end. So what are the ways in which we can help with that? I think becomes the operative question. Yep. So no, that's fine. We can go to the next slide. So I want to pause here and ask sort of these main questions, and we're going to do this in the large group together. What were the major barriers we missed? Obviously, we only highlighted some here in our PowerPoint presentation, but feel free, if you haven't had a chance to dive into the barriers report, to make sure that you offer the ones that you think are very important to include. They may already be in the draft, even if they weren't in this PowerPoint presentation. But we want to hear all the things. And if you have had a chance to read the report and something is missing, please let us know also. What did we get wrong? What else should we be considering? What are the barriers that are most important for us to address or be prioritized? This is looking forward to as we start to think about what are some potential recommendations. What do you think are the biggest hurdles or the most important hurdles that we should be focusing on first? And then who else should we be talking with? And I guess we have a note here. Don't worry, we're going to be talking about recommendations to solve, but we're still in the thick of like what's going wrong. And so let's kind of stay in that space today so that we can give full attention to the barriers discussion. And with that, I think what I'll do is if you would like to speak, if you could raise your emoji hand, that would be great, because then we can start having a queue of folks and make sure we let people talk and have their turn.
I'll paste the questions in the chat. Just give me 1 second.
All right, folks, now is your chance. All right, thank you. Gail, please.
Hi, thank you. I think it got touched on a little bit in the report, but I think from the zoning aspect, one thing that maybe could be fleshed out a bit more is how the zoning requirements, in addition to needing to be consistent with what the actual state statute is, also still has to meet with all the different statewide planning goals. And where it touched on that in the report is the appeal process and how, that could get overturned. But everything that we do from a zoning perspective is foundationed upon goal 1 and public involvement, which leads to the appeal process. So I don't know if there's a way to solve that, if we can remove child care centers and homes from being considered land use decisions and take it out of that LUBA appeal process. But maybe that could just be fleshed out a little bit more in the report.
Yeah, thank you. Local jurisdictions. I'm gonna pick on you all. What are some things that you heard that didn't resonate? Or things that did resonate that you want to amplify? Okay, Chanel.
I my understanding was that the fire marshal's office doesn't inspect the residential properties, like for the in-home childcare. And so I it would be helpful to maybe get some feedback from both BCE and the state's fire marshal office on what those expectations are for the permitting and like ongoing maintenance of these businesses.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
This is Chad Hawkins from the State Fire Marshal's Office. I serve as the Assistant Chief Deputy. And I think when we look at the maintenance of the facilities and looking at those barriers, probably taking a step back and looking at perspective as far as from the fire code's perspective and the maintenance of the life safety considerations is we talk about the code and where it was founded, and it develops a lot of consternation around why do we talk about sprinklers, and why do we talk about different things related to egress and evacuation plans. And that's because unfortunately we've had life loss related to these facilities in particular. And our highest life loss in the United States is actually single one and two family residents where these facilities could potentially be located. And so I would say from the maintenance perspective, we're always looking for opportunities as BCD has. We met with ELD about 12 to 16 months ago and creating I will just generally call it an alternate methods list to not have some of these requirements in place and still have the same level of life safety components in place. And so we're always looking to get to a really positive resolution while also being grounded in the fact that unfortunately in the United States, a stat I always hearken to is that fires in the United States have decreased dramatically. Fire fatalities in the United States have stayed the same since 1970. So we are still losing the same amount of people to fire, predominantly in one and two family residents, with the amount of fires being drastically reduced. So incidents do occur. If folks have been tracking, we had an adult foster home fire in Lebanon about a week and a half ago where there was a fire fatality in a licensed facility. So these incidents do happen. They do happen local. And so just I would say from the fire marshal's perspective and the Oregon Fire Code and working with our BCD partners who establish those certificates of occupancy and stuff, we do take that with all seriousness, looking at those life safety features, but also understanding there is an issue. There is a shortage of these facilities available. But I would, that's what I would have to say, and I would probably turn it to Tony Rocco from BCD to add more.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Chad. So from the building code perspective, we've already worked with Delk pretty closely on some solutions for the dwelling side of this. So I think when we were talking about childcare facilities, it's really important to bifurcate the two that we're talking about. We're talking about indwelling registered and certified family childcare homes, and then we're talking about commercial quote unquote facilities, right? So that's a critical thing to bifurcate, separate. So if we're looking at those in-home facilities, we've already worked with Delk on a really pretty reasonable path to either include a dwelling sprinkler system, which is often connected to just your potable water system, and like a multi-purpose system. These aren't like complex commercial sprinkler systems that you would think of or that you'd see at a theater or in a place of assembly. These are dwelling systems that are using residential heads, PEX, water lines, etc. So you can choose to design it with a sprinkler system or without. And when you do it without, there's just a couple of basic criteria that have to be met. And that's already in code. So right now, that's the option for those indwelling facilities. Now, if you're looking at, kind of the commercial design side, we very quickly navigate into things like OSBILS and OSBAY law for licensed engineers and architects in Oregon. So if depending on the facility, and any change of use in a commercial setting requires a licensed engineer or architect per their laws. And so then you're talking about national model code standards that have been in place, again, as Chad said, based on life loss for a long time. And so, changing something like that, we would probably be looking at maybe taking that to the national level first, before we look at any type of process or changing here in Oregon.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Tony and Chad. And I think I was remiss in the beginning by not saying this up front. And so I'm really glad that you two have talked. And Chuck and Petra, I'll get to you in just a second. So keep your hands up. Um, I just because something is a barrier doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. Right. So just like Gail was saying, like we still have to be compliant with goal 10, like or goal 1. There's a reason why we have public involvement. That's a thing. There's a reason why we have fire code and fire marshals, right? We want people to remain alive. There's a reason we have building codes. All of those, that is all true. And nobody is actually trying to just prevent our kids from having good childcare. That's not our goal. And so I think that we all need to keep in mind that just because something is a barrier doesn't mean that we need to change it or remove it. And sometimes there are barriers that exist that can be changed and moved that will make it easier so that the requirements that are necessary to preserve our children's lives and well-being are more easily met and accomplished. And I think we should all acknowledge that that we're not here to like take away all building codes or fire codes or zoning regulations. That would be there's a reason why we have them, and our lives are better and safer because of them. Okay, Petra and then Chuck.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. I'm one of the newbies. Petra Sheets, Planning Director with Benton County. Oh, we've had a couple of these incidents. I just want to thank you for this process because it is a helpful remedy to what I wanted to talk about, which is kind of the precursor frustration, which is I think that as government, both the state, the legislature, and the local level is it happens over and over again, just the inability to communicate and write OARs that don't conflict with each other's authority, right? Because at the local level, we are stuck implementing conflicting laws and spending inordinate amount of time and opportunity costs with our social capital with our clients. And it's very damaging to our relationships with our communities. And it's really hard to rebuild that trust when we play a part in the problem and we want to play a part in the solution. But I just wanted to comment on that. For Benton County in particular, we had the child care local liaisons. I won't call out the name or the organization. Actually write threats to our county commissioners complaining about staff, and there were potential disciplinary issues and things of that nature until that was all sorted out. And so, I mean, it's just really unfortunate amount of social capital that goes into these types of issues. But again, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate being a part of this group and having opportunity to be part of a solution. So thank you.
Chuck.
Yes, good morning. Chuck Arnold, City of Redmond. I want to make the tie to understanding that we have these standards and requirements and how that relates to economic development and how we can't get, we have a challenge of trying to get jobs in our communities because people can't find childcare. So I think there's a tie there to say one of the biggest barriers is the resources to meet these requirements, the capital. And since it's tied to economic development and jobs, I think there's really a role for Business Oregon to help fund some resources for people to meet these requirements so that we can bring the jobs to the communities because now they have childcare. So hopefully you understand that tie. And I really want to accent that. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. Advocates, childcare providers, and other folks who are not regulators or local government folks, I really want to amplify your voices too. So if you have thoughts or questions or concerns about barriers that we missed, information that you think we got wrong, or anything else that we should consider, I want to elevate and give you an opportunity to speak as well, please. Annalise.
One thing that I'm not seeing as part of this conversation is the differentiation between, as for family childcare, and for centers. I'll be a voice for centers as well. A differentiation between when a childcare is building, the building it's going into, whether it's a commercial building or it's a residential, it's a home, the differentiation between a childcare program that owns the building or rents, leases the space. Because there is a barrier when providers, whether they're centers or family childcare, when they own the building, there is not necessarily an ability to pay for it, right? Not that, I mean, funding is one thing, but there is the ability to at least be able to say yes or no, right? To make a decision. But if someone doesn't own the building, doesn't own the land, there is a third party that gets involved. Sorry, there's a baby in the background. I'm doing childcare. This is the thing for me. So yes. So I just want to raise that up, right? That there can be a barrier that is in between government and the entity, which is that person who owns that building, that land.
Yep. Thank you so much, Annalise. And that is true, not only sort of navigating building renovations, but it's also the time and allowed and whether the applicant has paid a lot of money to secure a property under a lease agreement before they know whether they're going to actually be able to open the business in question. All of that is there are so many hurdles that are become much more amplified or occur when you are leasing a property rather than when you own it. Fernanda.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna give the perspective from a provider myself, and how I have experienced these barriers. I have a registered childcare in my home, so I haven't experienced the challenges of going through the process for a center, but I have informed myself how to make next steps, maybe for certify or even in the future open a center. And I have to say that the things that make me hesitate a lot about going through the process is the opening slots that I can have. If I make all these changes for going certified, there are new things that I will need to implement in my house just for opening, not even like double slots if I hire staff. It's like, it doesn't open like that. It's just like maybe 3 more slots, and it doesn't cover my costs really to hire staff, which in my region, I'm in Coos County rural, Coos Bay. So it's very hard even for finding staff if I need to make all these efforts to, have more slots in my program. In paper, it doesn't make a lot of difference for me to make those changes because all the barriers that I need to face about staffing and the regulations and going certified, and not even talking about opening a center that I will need to go through all this procedures that is very overwhelming. I don't understand it quite well, but when I read the reports, I can feel like this is a lot for a small business. If you already are a big business and you have like 3 staffs in your place, maybe you can go through this process. I opened my business a year ago, and I think I'm very qualified. I have 2 degrees in education, and I have like 10 years experience in teaching. And I really want to open more slots because I have a waiting list of 10 kids in my program. But these steps of going forward, I think, is what makes me hesitate to do those next steps. So I just wanted to share my experience because this is what I hear from other providers. And this is what I feel is the big issue for us from our perspective.
Thank you so much, Fernando. We appreciate your time coming here also. We know that it's a lot, so thank you. Other folks want to talk about major barriers we missed or information we got wrong? If not, we can talk about those barriers that we think are most important to put our collective minds to helping resolve. not actually honing in on what the resolution is, but what are the things that you think are either sort of the best low-hanging fruit, or the most important barriers to address? Okay, Whitney.
Hi, everyone. This might seem like a small barrier when we're talking about major barriers, but one thing that continually comes to mind as I'm newer in this position to DELC is thinking about accessibility. And when we talk about accessibility, my thoughts immediately go to when a provider right now with startup and expansion grants going out, the infrastructure funds going out, it is very hard for them to, in some cities, access the resource and the steps to even get started. So they know that they need to get licensed, or if they're going to do registered family, but they don't necessarily know where to go to or what the layout is going to look like when interacting with city planning. So one thing I'd really like to see is, and I've seen some cities do it, but just a basic document that kind of lays out how you're going to interact with your city and the zoning. If that would be, I think it seems like it's such a small barrier, but if we don't have access to how to even truly get started, other than here's a link to go to licensing, we need readily more universal available resources for people who are getting started and expanding. And that's something I notice that continually is reoccurring in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Whitney. The basic navigation, where the heck am I and how do I get through here? It seems like good information. And then when we think about future recommendations, you just amp up or ramp up then what technical assistance might be made available for that. Yeah. What else? What are other big barriers? We've heard some talk about sort of, I call it like ships in the night, but sometimes it's like, what are the conflicting regulatory pieces that folks think are present that serve as barriers?
Another one we've heard is, so, fire marshal will give you an occupancy rating, and that's very different than what, childcare licensure will give you in terms of how many children you can serve. And those different occupancy ratings may have different implications. So, for example, we talked to a center who was, got their childcare licensure, how many kids they could serve in their space. And then they built the required bathrooms according to that. And then fire marshal later came through and said, no, you can actually have this many people in your space, not to provide childcare, but globally. And that means you need to have handicap accessible bathrooms. So they had to go and remodel, kind of tear down everything that they'd done, expand the square footage of their bathrooms, start from scratch, which are the type of things that they, don't have the money to do.
Yeah, that is a fantastic example where each requirement makes sense and has logic based in the kind of sphere of influence and what they're thinking about. But when they overlap, if an applicant isn't aware of how they work together, they can find themselves in a heap of trouble. Yeah, Chad.
I would just provide some clarity for folks on the phone as far as like occupancy. Oh, the state fire marshal or local fire districts, we actually don't determine occupancy. So when that C of O is issued by the local building official, once all the process has taken place to get to the maintenance stage, which is when we show up, the building occupancy and type has already been determined, and we're just maintaining it through the fire code by another determination. We don't determine it. So if we showed up and noticed something was amiss, it was probably referred back to the original C of O that was issued and just rectifying maybe something that was overlooked. Because ones that come to us again, we just maintain the building. The building code, I would say, drives the conversation when it comes to, establishing occupancy and whatnot.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chad. And I think where some of again, the like, we're talking with each other, but we're not hearing what the other is trying to say. Where that miscommunication might happen is if occupancy is set by building code and building officials and inspectors, but they're saying this is for fire purposes. That might be where some of the confusion happens. And then if you all come in and you're just enforcing what is supposed to be happening, then it seems to me that is a plausible way some of these miscommunications can happen.
Absolutely. And it does, to be clear, it does happen. We're a lot in the healthcare setting as well. And it's very typical for situations like that to arise when someone's doing a remodel. The other thing, and I was just thinking about it as we were having this conversation, the barriers, maybe from the fire official side, the perspective I could provide is, we have a lot of licensing agencies that have different rule requirements that are not consistent with either the building code or the fire code. So whether it be like home oxygen storage or other things, for example, they have written rules within their agencies to, kind of highlight, and with all good intent and purpose, how you should do a certain thing, but it's not consistent with code. And then we'll show up and do a fire inspection, renewal inspection or whatever it may be, approve it. And then they may be told by a licensor later, oh, you're supposed to be doing this. And then they're like, well, the fire official told me that's okay, or vice versa. And so that's definitely something we've had conversations definitely on the adult foster home side that we see quite a bit with ODDS, OHA, all of the different facilities having rules that are fire and life safety rules that are not consistent with the fire code, and it just again creates just the exact same situation that the previous person mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And so everybody get your big brains on, because we're going to be talking about and thinking about how do we help ameliorate some of those discrepancies or inconsistencies. Kurt.
Hi, everybody. Kurt Wilson. I'm an architect in Eugene. And I think that if we talk about barriers, I think about it in terms of the sequence of barriers. And a lot of it's kind of in following up on what Whitney said, a lot of this is kind of how do you get started, what makes sense to get started, and those kinds of things. And a lot of the feedback from the survey, as I was hearing it, really related to the initial feasibility or logic of doing a project, whether it makes sense or not. And as an architect, I want a client to not feel like they have to hire the architect on day one. They need to be able to have enough understanding of what they're intending to do, what they can do, what they can't do, and before they commit to the resources of hiring a design professional. And so a lot of what has been described, overlapping regulations, different agencies, different perspectives, different codes. It is confusing. There's just no way around it. As someone who's been doing this for a long time, I don't find it as confusing as I did when I started, but this is my profession. And while it is confusing, it is definable and explainable. So I think that what would really be useful is some information written for providers that could help them understand what to look for, not only in the way the regulatory process works and how that changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but also a little bit of information of how the building code and the fire code look at these issues to help them start to identify some types of facilities that would make sense. So I think there's some ways to provide some information to start the process. So at least you're pursuing something that you're going in the right direction. At some point, you're going to need to get a building permit. As Tony said, you're probably going to need to have an architect or engineer on board based on the size of your project. fire sprinklers and fire code issues and exiting are vastly important for life safety. And I would never want to try and diminish those. And so you need just to find a solution that makes most sense for you and your facility and your budget and those kinds of things. So
Yeah. Thank
more
you for
resources early on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And we're going to be doing more thinking about the big question, how do I find the right site, which I think is what you're emphasizing, and who can help me do that effectively. And I guess the one last thing I'll mention is how can I figure that out when there's low vacancy in commercial spaces? Because a lot of jurisdictions don't have a lot of available space, and people are wanting it, especially if new construction's not happening for those kinds of spaces. Okay, so let's see here. Brad, I'm going to give you a chance, and then I think we're going to want to pivot because we're going to be going into small breakout here pretty soon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brad. I'm building official, so I am familiar with a lot of what you guys are talking about, and it is one of the most confusing parts of building code is childcare stuff. So it doesn't surprise me that people that aren't in this field, I mean, it's hard enough for people that are in this field to navigate what the requirements are. So kind of agree with Kurt that there needs to be a handout that all the different entities can agree on that gives guidance to you can give guidance to building officials and planners and architects and all the people because they're just trying to figure it out as they go, and it's confusing, and I'm sure each jurisdiction has its own take or interpretation on what the requirements are. And I know I've required things that maybe weren't right when I look back on it because it was so confusing. So and the other thing is kind of to back up what Fernandez said. There aren't a lot of options to move up. It's like you're either in home or you move to a childcare, which has way more requirements and way more licensing, and to step up and go from like 10 kids to 20 or something is not really feasible. It just seems like a lot. So that's why I think it'd be nice if we could find a way to get more options or get rid of some of the barriers to help them have a step instead of moving to a 40 kid childcare where they have a bunch of staff and can make it pencil. So I guess that was one of the things I had mentioned was getting rid of the in-home requirement. That seems like a pretty big barrier for somebody to be able to afford a home, especially in Bend. And I know most places it's getting pretty expensive to also have enough space to run a childcare. People want to be able to have a home or buy a separate home to run the childcare in, but now they don't live in it. And a lot of jurisdictions don't like that. And the building code doesn't really address it either to say if you can or can't do that. But there really isn't any more safety issue in my mind if you don't live there. So that was a couple of my thoughts on the bigger barriers.
Thank you so much. Annalise, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move us on because I want to make sure I give plenty of time for the breakout session, but please hold your thought because if we have any time at the end of today in our report out section, we'll be sure to call back on you. I definitely want to give you the opportunity to talk.
Drop it in the chat because I'm monitoring that.
Oh yeah, or drop in the chat. Perfect. So Leanne, if you can bring the PowerPoint back up. We are about to go into small breakout room. We're going to create 3 breakouts. And we're going to talk about disparate impacts. And in our report, we've noted some. Can you go to the next slide, please?
I'm a little frozen. Hold on.
Oh, okay. All right. So some of the disparate impacts we've identified thus far are the differences between being in a rural area and an urban area. They have different issues that they confront. And language barriers, obviously, if as English proficient speakers, we're having a hard time figuring out all of these processes and how to navigate. Imagine what it's like if you're an English language learner, particularly if the resources or the people helping you aren't fluent in the language that you speak. Church-based childcare centers also have unique challenges. They are uniquely situated often because they are embedded in neighborhoods and they seem like they would be good places to have childcare facilities, but they are often conditional uses, and that process, as we've discussed, is tricky. Communities of color also have some difficulties, and I think Brad was just talking about that, about well, a piece of that, which is home-based programs operate out of single-family homes, and Bend and other places, those are very expensive homes. Communities of color are less likely to be homeowners and face difficult challenges for having home-based care in multifamily apartments. And then tribal nations. We are continuing to work on obtaining more nuanced feedback about what barriers specific to sovereign nations experience. They have different rules and requirements. And so if there are people who have experience with that or thoughts, we would very much like to hear your feedback. And next slide, we're going to go into small group now, and we'll be pasting these questions in the chat, but we want to understand and discuss sort of what are the specific barriers that communities might face, talking about BIPOC folks, English language learners, churches and other culturally specific providers, and some of the differences in these other groups. And then next slide. Maybe.
Sorry, I don't know why it's. There we go.
There we go. Here are the questions that we're going to be tackling together. We have about 25 minutes, I think. What are specific barriers that communities might face? How can we make the development process more accessible? Are there sort of disparate barriers that are in the report that aren't included, or that we touched on that you don't believe are correct? And have we left out any specific communities? And if so, what are the other considerations that we should include? So with that, I think tech team, we're ready to go into small group. We'll have facilitators and note takers, and our note takers are going to do the report out when we come back to the large group. So we're just really looking forward for you all to speak freely and brainstorm answers to these questions together.
Welcome back. Leanne, just to let you know, Cadence had to step away for just 2 seconds.
Oh, okay. I'll give everyone a second to join back in. And Gail, I know you got cut off before you were about to say something really helpful. So if you want to put it in the chat, please do. I don't know. Cadence interrupted me. I can't see everyone, but if you get back in the room, let me know. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and start with the report outs. Group number 1.
Okay, I was group number 1 note taker. Cadence was the facilitator. There she is. Do you want me, Leanne, you want me to just go through all of it all in one stint, or did you want to break it up? Yeah.
We've got a good chunk of time, so.
Okay, thank you. We had a really good discussion. I appreciate all the contributions of work group number 1. For the first question about specific development barriers that these communities might face and how can we make that process, the development process, more accessible. We spent some time talking about the use of technical bulletins that are in plain language and translated to inform and sort of simplify the process for folks attempting to navigate it, particularly the codes and regulatory language, so that folks know where to start and how to navigate in a simplified way. There was some good discussion around how all of this is already confusing to an English-speaking person. And it's doubly or triply or more so confusing for someone who's not an English-speaking person. And so we talked about translation services and also sort of concierge services to help folks navigate the process. There were some great comments about how to get resources to the providers that need it, sort of noting that most of the providers that are navigating the process are able to for one reason or another, or are at least attempting to, while there are many others who aren't able to. Either it's not in a language they can read, or you don't know where to start, or there's just no good way to initiate the process that they feel comfortable, and it's resulting in a lot of providers not pursuing the licensure process or expanding care in a way that meets families' needs. For the second question about considerations in the report that we missed or maybe incorrect, you'll have to forgive me. There might be some notes in here that belong in other categories, but there was a great point raised about how we may want to add or maybe missed entirely the intersection of childcare and houselessness, and how we are ensuring access to childcare for unhoused families and providing the early learning environments, or at least reducing barriers around that to make sure that that's an opportunity for all families. We had some conversation asking the question of how are we funding facilities in a way that meets families where they're at. And we've taken sort of a business model centric approach to addressing the regulatory barriers, but how are we ensuring that providers are able to meet families where they're at? Let's see here. Accessibility for families based on what they can afford. And we talked a bit about how the high cost of navigating the regulatory process and even having a facility that you own or lease or rent or any arrangement that you might encounter, the cost of establishing your facility and getting licensed is passed on to the families that are needing the care. And so there's sort of a double lens of accessibility there, accessibility for the provider, but also accessibility for the families needing that care. We talked a bit about how we reduce barriers for children with unique needs, and what does it look like to have a trauma-informed facility or facilities with specific physical improvements that children with physical needs would require for care. There was some great comments about how the neighbor impact model is successful, and we could explore that, and a suggestion that we look at the Oregon Health Authority for navigator models. And then the third question, we left any communities out. This is not right for this bucket, but Tony shared that we really should be looking at licensure laws in ORS 671 and 672. And I wrote that down so I could go read a little bit more about it. And with the intent to make the obligations more clear for everyone. So kind of a nod back to the technical bulletin simplified element. Communities that we left out or could spend some more time with included migrant worker families and their specific needs, and again, children with behavioral health, mobility, learning, and other challenges that haven't been addressed specifically. And those are my notes, unless I missed anything. Group 1, did I miss anything? Okay, thank you. Great discussion.
Thank you, Angie, and Group 1. Group 2.
Alrighty. So we had a lot to say on the first question, so we didn't quite go through the others, but I think we addressed the others in our first question. So first of all, I think that we just acknowledged right off the bat how the history of exclusion in planning, business, like economic development, all of that kind of just makes these issues with zoning, cost, language barriers, et cetera, more acute in general. And so that was just right off the bat, all of the development barriers that we've talked about are just going to be even harder if you are BIPOC or if English isn't your primary language. And then the other thing that comes with that history of exclusion is that it has caused a distrust of government. And so that might mean that even if you have updates that might try to erase some of these development barriers, the uptake on those updates aren't going to, increase immediately. And so there's a little bit of trust that needs to be established before we can fully address these barriers. And right along with that distrust of government, something we didn't quite get to discuss as much in our report is the impact on tribal nations. And so one of our group members discussed the fact that there's increased funding that could have been distributed to a tribal nation, but there was a little bit of distrust with the regulations and oversight that would have come with that funding. And so they weren't comfortable with that, and it kind of got in the way of being able to take on that funding and fully make use of it. And so was some discussion about how do we handle that. We didn't come to a conclusion, but it's something to consider. We also discussed, we reiterated the need for having a process document or step-by-step outline because of the confusion that comes with all of the requirements and different requirements at different jurisdictional levels. Something else that we talked about was the lack of support for existing childcare providers, or rather, there is a feeling that there's a heavier focus on how do we get new providers into this space? How do we get more childcare providers to start? But there are existing childcare providers that would love to expand and provide higher quality. And so focusing on how we can provide more funding or make the process easier for that would be appreciated. And then the last thing we talked about was just noticing that childcare is not outright permitted in all zones. And there was a perspective that, childcare might be kind of like a fire station, for example, where it is needed everywhere. And so why isn't it allowed everywhere? That was a question that came up. And we had someone else in our group who I think was kind of trying to answer that question, but we didn't quite get to fully discuss that. So yeah, if I missed anything or if you want to finish the thought that you had in group number 2 in the comments, let me know.
All right, thank you, Taylor. Group 3.
Hi, Kelly Reed with DLCD. I was the note taker for group 3. Thanks to everyone in the group, and please feel free to jump in after if I miss anything that you said. I'm going to kind of start from the end. So as far as, folks, groups that maybe the report didn't talk about or could highlight more. We also talked about non-English speakers, similar to the other 2 groups, how like the language barrier is just huge when it comes to these highly technical issues. And then we also talked a little bit about immigrant and refugee communities, related to the language barrier, of course, but also maybe there are other barriers for those groups as well that could be dug into a little more. And also, as the other groups discussed, farm worker workforce and how their needs might be different for childcare because of the seasonal nature of that work. We talked a lot about rural issues specifically, especially that in the rural areas, there just aren't as many contractors out there to do the work and the building upgrades that are needed. An example was, it takes months just to get on a contractor's schedule for window replacement because there's only one window replacement contractor in the entire county, in a very rural county. And that the contractors that are there are quite busy. And so it takes a lot of time to find someone to get on their schedule. And then if you have to kind of go outside of your area and get someone from a larger city to come, that also can come with higher costs as well for, all the travel. Other difficulties with finding folks to, do your remodeling is that, a lot of contractors aren't wanting to take on the small jobs. They're so busy with the larger jobs. And related to that, the Business Oregon Childcare Infrastructure funding that's coming along is going to have a 3-year timeline on it. Is that long enough considering the delays that could happen with the construction due to all the contractor issues? And then also in rural areas, just generally, in unincorporated rural communities that are kind of like small towns, but they're not actually incorporated cities. They're still considered county. That providers there have had difficulty understanding who to talk to and what their process is, because they're kind of unique in a unique kind of land use category there. And then lastly, 2 last things about things that weren't really covered in the report that maybe are barriers that we'd want to talk about. Homeowners associations and how some of them may have rules that prohibit the use of a residence as a business, like childcare. Annalise mentioned that there is a law from 2018 in Oregon that prohibits HOAs from prohibiting family childcare, but there may be HOAs that predate that law that already had that prohibition on the books. And so there might still be lots of neighborhoods out there where you just can't do a childcare because of HOA rules. And that, likely that rule is not enforced equally everywhere. And so, and some HOAs might not even know that rule exists. And lastly, prevailing wages. So when a project is being funded with any public dollars, then they have to pay prevailing wages to the construction firms and construction workers there, and those wages can be quite high. And so the funding that is being used doesn't really go far enough to really pay for what's needed. But that's specific to childcare facilities that are being built with public dollars. So anything I missed, anyone feel free to jump in. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. All right. Before we move on to next steps, Annalise, did you want to make your previous comment, or has the moment passed? You have the floor if you'd like it.
I do not remember what I was going to say.
Okay.
And I'm not in a position where I can put something in the chat. So
Okay.
it'll come to me some other time, I'm sure.
All right. Please send DLCD an email or reach out to us. We definitely want to have all your feedback.
Cadence, along those lines, Brad had his hand up right before we went to small groups too. I wonder if we have time to offer that to him.
I didn't.
You didn't? It was a
I just
remnant
forgot
hand.
to put it down from the first time. Thank you, though.
Okay.
All right. Well, I mean, we have a couple minutes. Does anybody have kind of a last thought before I turn it over to Leanne to talk towards, we have a little bit of a last discussion on next steps.
Just want to share one more concrete experience that we've been hearing about from a childcare provider who's attempting to open an infant toddler program in a home in a rural setting, and is being told that I think that they need to connect to sewer instead of using septic tanks, and they're trying to explain and if it was a family living there, they could stay on septic, but because it's a childcare, they have to go to sewer, except it's a childcare that would be only licensed for infants and toddlers. So they're like, infants and toddlers don't really use the sewer because we're just changing diapers. Like, if you want to increase our garbage, that's one thing. But just one more example, and what I don't understand, like, we're looking at in the childcare space, whether there could be kind of standard waivers or exceptions or something like that could be clear and transparent and publicized. I don't understand how that works in the building code space. Are we allowed to give waivers or make exceptions? And could there be some kind of agreement that, like, under these criteria, here are some standard waivers that, anyone in this situation could receive to save significant, like literally thousands and thousands of dollars in potential costs.
So, hey, Dana, this is Annalise. We're the legal representatives of the union here in Oregon. And if you send them our way, we can provide some representation that can help that person navigate that if they're a family childcare provider. So, or want to be a family childcare provider.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of experience dealing with
Great,
that.
thank
So,
you.
yeah, those are people that if you want to send them our way, we're happy to help them and provide some representation.
Great. And to Dana's point, if we can figure out a standardized way for some certain subsets of issues that we could then disseminate publicly to different jurisdictions, that might be very useful and something more we can talk about next time. Okay, so I think with that, Leanne, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about moving towards recommendations.
All right. So yeah, our next work group meeting is going to be centered around presenting the draft recommendations and getting your feedback and input on those. And one of the things as we kind of like, we're going to, spend some more time revising the barriers report and making sure that that's all squared away before we jump into the recommendations. But as we do kind of start looking towards that step, we wanted some initial guidance on or ideas around prioritization. There's a lot in the barriers report, and there's a lot of different ways to address some of these barriers as well. So, concentrating on things that might be easier but have a lower impact, or things that really need immediate attention that we need to draw, eyes to from the legislature, or recommendations that could be more long-term goals in remedying some of these issues. But yeah, so I thought we'd spend a few minutes just opening it up to the group to see if you all had any thoughts on how we might consider, creating a matrix around some of these recommendations, so to speak. Maybe I'll stop sharing that for a moment. I know a lot of you have been, providing sort of solutions as you call out barriers to this process, and we've been cataloging all of that. So we have a really great place to start from, but any thoughts on prioritization? Patrick.
The first thing I think of is the the local government or the state agency or another organization that would be impacted or be expected to help to implement changes. For example, if local zoning codes are inconsistent with state statutes in regard to childcare facilities, DLCD should work with local governments to make those updates, to streamline those processes. But that's first thing that comes to mind is like who would be responsible, who would be impacted by these prospective changes, and who ultimately would be responsible to lead that effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, establishing roles is going to be really important. All right, Lee.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what I've been hearing on confusion of who is responsible for what, but I think a lot of that is a confusion of communications responsibilities. And so I think when we would, when we consider how we shape up recommendations, it should really be within a framework of like, what is the communications infrastructure or channels, that is in place to be able to share those recommendations, whatever those changes might be, to really start off with a clear system into which those recommendations are slotted so that we know that they can effectively be communicated to the audience, client, jurisdiction, business that needs to hear them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dawn.
Lee just said it exactly what I was going to say, so thank you.
All right, I thought I saw one other hand. Did I miss someone? Peter.
Yeah, hi guys. Peter Graham with Scott Edwards Architecture. So as we've worked on primarily larger facility-based commercial childcare centers, a lot of work with Oregon Child Development in many counties statewide. And in listening to the discussions over the last several months, I really like the idea of sorting these into baskets for sort of home-based recommendations and commercial facilities, because they're very different tracks. So it feels like if you're going down, a lot of home-based providers are and I want to be careful how I phrase it, but I think are likely going to have less experience in development and are going to need more guidance and more templates and more roadmaps versus larger providers who may have done this in the past and need more targeted solutions. So just wanted to throw that out there. That feels like a good sort of organizational model in general for the recommendations.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
I just want to lift up the by right zoning idea as one potential barrier that could be removed or reduced. But the by right being like the potential solution to the barrier of like conditional use, that requirement for upfront capital to gain the site control on a property only to then not know when or if the site that you gain control of can be used for childcare is a huge barrier that we hear about a lot, and one I hope we come back to in the recommendation.
Thank you.
The second thing I wanted to lift up is this, I think someone named it earlier, what about the idea of having small centers in residential homes, or basically, being able to operate childcares in homes that don't require someone to live there, because that requiring someone to live there then means something for the space structurally. Like you have to have that set aside building, you have to have that perfect tenant who's willing to live in a space with the childcare. And it's not clear that there's a like, why do we have to do that? So that's another one.
Annalise.
Thank you, Dana. That is what reminded me of what I was going to say earlier. the micro center. Somebody had mentioned the micro center earlier, and I was going to comment that I am extremely curious to find out what a micro center will look like in a residential setting that the micro center allows 30 children. So with all the other discussion and with all the current problems, it seems like we're going to be introducing another problem with the micro center, another zoning code problem. If we're going to allow 30 children possibly in a residential setting under a micro center, then that begs the question of why family child care would need to be limited to 16 if the residential setting is now going to allow 30 if you're a micro center. Do you see what I'm I just can't make that I cannot make that cognitive connection logically work.
All right, any final thoughts before we address the very next steps? All right. Share my screen one final time. Yeah, so like I said, we're going to work on refining the barriers report. We've got a lot of really great feedback just in this meeting and some starting to come in via email. So we'll make sure all of that gets addressed and any kind of clarifying meetings that we need to have to get the technical details laid out accurately. We'll spend the time to do that. And then we're going to be engaging in another round of conversations with providers, regulators, and different people working in the industry to develop our recommendations and to get feedback on how those are coming along. And then we'll spend our next work group meeting going over those recommendations with you. And those will be draft at that point. So we have a good amount of time to refine those with this work group. So we're excited. I know a lot of you are anxious to get to that part of this. So, and we are as well. So that'll be the good stuff, I think. And yeah, please continue to reach out to DLCD. Feel free to email Cadence or I with any additional thoughts or needs related to the project. And we will see you all again in August. Did I have that right? August? And then Cadence?
End of July.
July?
July 26th.
Okay, so almost August.
Yeah. Don't make summer go by too fast, Leanne. I need every warm day I can get. I just want to put a finer point on two things. The first is I made a joke about the short length of our report. It is fairly hefty. And we would very much appreciate you all taking a look at it and providing specific feedback on the report. It's obviously not mandatory, but it would help us. And eventually the contents of the report are really from you all. And so we want to make sure that it is reflective and something that you are willing to stamp as it goes to the legislature. So we very much appreciate your feedback. The second is, Leanne did say that when we come back next time, we're going to have some draft recommendations, and I'm going to call that the starting place of a discussion about recommendations. Because we don't want to come empty-handed to a conversation and be like, well, what should we do about it? We want to make sure we come with information that you all have already provided, things we've heard from the focus groups, et cetera. And we really want you guys to spend the next whatever time, month and a half, thinking about what specific recommendations you would like to be considered by the group, and come prepared to offer those next time. And we will have a fourth meeting to talk through sort of final versions of those recommendations. So I think it's really important for us to consider next time a deep brainstorming session where we're talking through all the things. And I just want to have your homework, if you will, is please review the barriers report and also do some thinking and maybe write down some ideas about recommendations you'd like to discuss next time.
And I don't think I specifically mentioned, but if you all can provide feedback to DLCD staff or us, whatever, I think we'd maybe prefer to go through DLCD so they can kind of keep it all in one place. But by June 17th, that would be really helpful.
Okay. Are there any questions before we close today? Okay, well then, thank you so much for your time and attention. We really appreciate your help. We definitely cannot do it without you. So looking forward to hearing more from you all soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, guys.